Hi, John Bullard here. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to give you a step-by-step method for learning to read standard notation on the 5-string banjo. There'll be some links in the description to resources that are going to help you accomplish this goal. As always, these are my opinions and these are based on my own experience and things that helped me along the way. And just a little disclaimer, I do not recommend reading standard notation for learning or playing bluegrass music. Some of you may recall the old Scruggs book, which is what I used to learn to play the banjo with. And in this book, they actually have standard notation above the tablature. And if anything, the standard notation was just confusing. And the reason for this, I believe, is that it's very difficult to communicate Scruggs banjo licks in the form of standard notation. It's just not a very good medium to communicate banjo licks or Scruggs style licks. So if you're interested in only bluegrass, then reading standard notation is not really of any benefit. In Scruggs style banjo playing, it's lick based, and so tablature is a good way to represent those licks. And with tablature, you begin to be able to recognize certain licks by seeing them in tablature. For instance, you might learn to recognize just what that looks like in tablature, or so those things, after a while, you can just see those licks in tablature, and it's a much more efficient way to learn bluegrass. So this video is aimed more towards people who are interested in learning to play classical music on the banjo, or even learning a lot of fiddle tunes on the banjo. Classical music or through composed music is not really lick-based, so standard notation is the better way to work on that kind of music. Standard notation scores communicate the melody much more clearly. You see the melody rise and fall graphically represented in the notation. You're able to have dynamics and phrasing written into the score, and it's a much more efficient and better way to learn through composed or classical style music. With standard notation, you even begin to see the harmony within the music. If you're following standard notation in a score and you see certain accidentals, you are kind of clued into that the key has changed, or there is a secondary dominant chord, or whatever it is. The standard notation is a good way to eventually learn to see the harmony in the music. The benefits of being able to read standard notation on the banjo are that if you're interested in doing your own transcriptions of classical music for the banjo, learning to read standard notation is pretty key. And being able to read through a lot of fiddle tunes in, say, a fiddle tune book like O'Neill's Irish Fiddle Tunes, or other fiddle tune collections, is very beneficial to be able to read the standard notation and just check out a fiddle tune to see if it's something you like. Another reason for reading standard notation on the banjo is that this opens up a whole world of music that you can sample or read through to see if it's something you like, to see what it sounds like. It might be something written for other instruments, but still, if you can read through some of it, you might be able to tell whether it's something you want to work on or not. Another good reason for learning to read on the banjo is reading standard notation on the banjo opens up the whole world of classic fingerstyle banjo, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But this was a popular way of playing the banjo in the Victorian era, and all the music then was communicated via standard notation, and there's some wonderful pieces available in that whole library that you might want to look at and be able to play, or at least read through them and see if it's something that you like. Also, if you're planning to play with other people in a classical style setting, reading from a score and following a score is pretty essential. In rehearsals and performance, people will refer to certain measure numbers or notes and things as a point of reference. And everybody being on the same page, pun intended, is crucial. In a rehearsal, someone might say, look at measure 84 when the banjo has an E, let's get soft there, or something to that effect. So following along in a score is pretty crucial. Also, if you're playing in an ensemble and you happen to get off and you get lost a little bit, if you have a score in front of you, it's easier to find your way back to where you're supposed to be. Before we get into the actual method of learning to read on the banjo, I wanted to touch on the topic of transposition. The banjo is a transposing instrument. And what that means is that the actual pitches of the banjo that we hear sound an octave lower than the music that's written. I know that sounds confusing. The reason for that is that the actual pitches of the banjo fall mostly between the treble clef and the bass clef. In other words, it exists kind of in between the bass clef and the treble clef, where some would be on the bass clef and some would be on the treble clef, and it would make things very hard to read. So for writing music, for banjo music, the music is transposed up an octave. So it's written an octave higher than it sounds. And I've got a little graphic to look at to explain this. If you'll look at this graphic, you'll see two measures, both in treble clef. The one on the left are the actual pitches of the banjo, and not the fifth string, just the fourth, third, second, and first strings. So I'll play those pitches. These are just open strings on the banjo. So D, G, B, and D. And you can see how these notes fall pretty much below the treble clef. And that's what I was talking about as far as the actual pitches being hard to read. So if we transpose these notes up an octave, which we do for banjo notation, on the right-hand measure, you'll see these notes, the same notes, but they're actually fall on the treble clef. So this would be the same notes transposed up an octave in this right-hand measure. D, G, B, and D. And if you notice, there's a little tiny 8 at the bottom of the treble clef. And sometimes that symbol is used to notate that the music is transposed up an octave. That's not always used, so I wouldn't depend on that. But that's what that little 8 dangling at the bottom of the treble clef means. Now again, let's look at these two measures represented on the graphic. And this is the same thing as we went over before, only with the fourth string dropped down to C. So on the left we have the actual pitches of the banjo with the fourth string dropped to C. So this is that tuning that you would use to play Home Sweet Home or something like that, which is used a lot in bluegrass, but I wanted to cover that the way these notes look in notation as well. So on the left, actual pitches with the fourth string tuned to C. So C, G, B, D. And if you look over to the right, you'll see again these same notes, but they're transposed up an octave. And so the C actually is on the first ledger line below the treble clef, and then the other notes fall in the clef. So here's the transposed up an octave. Same pitches, C, G, B, D. And now you can see it's way easier to read these notes when they're transposed up an octave. So that's how banjo music is typically written, transposed up an octave. And it's the same for the guitar. The guitar is a transposing instrument as well. One more thing before we dive into the method is the idea of sight reading on the banjo or even the guitar. And this can be a little bit tricky because on stringed instruments like the banjo and the guitar, there are multiple places to get certain notes. For example, listen to this D, which is the first string open. But I can also play that same pitch with the second string 3rd fret, or 3rd string 7th fret, or 4th string 12th fret. So it's very complex when we start thinking about sight reading, which means sitting down and reading a piece of music that we've never seen before, because there are multiple places to get many of the notes. And it's all about knowing where you're starting and where you're going. And with practice, sight reading is possible on the guitar and the banjo. We obviously have examples of people who are very good sight readers on guitar, and I've seen people who are very good sight readers on banjo. So it just takes practice and kind of learning to know where you're starting and where you're going. So let's get on with this method for reading on the banjo. The first step in this method that I'm going to recommend is to get this book, MelBay's Banjo Method by Frank Bradbury. Now this book, and I'll put a link in the description for this book. This is an old book, and many years ago when I first got it, it was in 2 volumes like this. And sometime recently, MelBay has condensed it to 1 volume that looks like this, but it's the same information about the banjo and about how to read on the banjo. Now this Bradbury book is really based on the classic fingerstyle of banjo playing. This is the Victorian era style of playing the banjo. And in this style, the 4th string is usually tuned down to C. So bear that in mind when you're looking in the Bradbury book, that the 4th string is almost always tuned down to C. And if the string is supposed to be tuned up to D, there'll usually be a little note in the upper left-hand part of the score that says 4th string tuned to D. So in the classic banjo era, and then in the Bradbury book, and also in the classic banjo.ning website that we'll talk about in a minute, all the music is based on the banjo having the 4th string tuned down to C. So you want to bear that in mind. If the 4th string is meant to be tuned up to D, there'll usually be, as I said, a little note in the score saying tune 4th string to D. So keep that in mind. Now having the 4th string tuned down to C is not going to confuse you later on when you're reading on the banjo. It sounds like it might, but it really doesn't. Reading on the banjo is really the same difficulty level whether you have the 4th string tuned to C or whether you have it tuned up to D, and you'll be able to go back and forth between the two, and it really doesn't present a problem. So my first step is to actually get the Bradbury book, as I mentioned, and just go through this book methodically as if you knew nothing about the banjo. I would like you to go through the book about even the beginning, about how to hold the banjo, what are the notes on the banjo, how do they represent it on the staff. I covered some of this just now, but this book goes through everything you need to know about reading music on the banjo, about rhythms and everything. So my recommendation for step 1 is to go through these pages very slowly and methodically, maybe only a page or 2 a day. If you focus on just understanding the information in this book, not memorizing. You do not want to memorize anything about these examples or pieces that are in the book. You just want to learn how to read what's on the page, then move on. So if you go through these examples a little bit each day and just learn where the notes are on the banjo, don't worry about memorizing anything. Go to the next page the next day, learn where those notes are on the banjo, go to the next page the next day. That's what I recommend doing. Now, when we're doing this, we're probably not going to be able to play the rhythms of the notes in perfect time or anything like that, and I wouldn't worry about that at first. The main thing is to go through and learn how to find the notes on the banjo and begin to try to decipher what the rhythms of those notes might be, even though you might not be able to play them in time right away. So if you proceed through the book this way, you will begin to get familiar with where the notes are on the banjo neck, and you'll begin to get familiar with these rhythms. And just if you do a little bit each day, not memorizing, just learning, reading the information, the focus is on reading and then moving on. A little bit each day is what you want to aim for. So if you progress to the end of the book doing this, you will have learned a lot already about learning to read on the banjo, but what I would recommend doing is to go back to the beginning and start over. This time trying to be a little more accurate with playing the rhythms, and don't worry about playing things fast. Play things extremely slowly, but play them maybe in rhythm and finding the notes on the banjo. Don't memorize anything. Just look at each example, make sure you understand how to play that, then move on. So progressing through the book the second time that way, again, when you get to the end, you will have learned a lot more about reading on the banjo. And my recommendation is to go back to the beginning of the book and do it, yes, a 3rd time. I actually did this when I got this book in the beginning and went through it 3 or 4 times, and it really does work to just slowly go through the book, making sure you're not trying to memorize anything, just that you're reading the notes on the page, and by the 3rd or 4th time through the book, you'll begin to be able to play the rhythms in time, even if you play them very slowly. But if you count methodically, tap your foot and count aloud if you need to. You'll begin to be able to play these examples in time and finding the right notes on the banjo. So I want to emphasize about this Bradbury book that you don't want to worry about how fast you're going through the book. You don't want to worry about memorizing anything. You just want to slowly go through the book in a methodical way, reading what's on each example, each page, and just take in a little information each day, put it away, maybe practice, work on it for 10 to 15 minutes tops each day, then put it away and move on. And if you do that every day, you'll make progress. The second step in this method for learning to read on the banjo is to go to a website called classicbanjo.ning. And there's a link in the description for this website. When you get to this website, you can register on the site for free, and there's a music library. And if you'll see on the homepage, it says Music Library. And if you go to the music library, you'll see there's a tab for beginner scores. And you want to go to these beginner scores. Most of the scores on this site have a label for either easy, intermediate, or difficult, or something to that effect, so that you can tell the pieces that are the easier ones, and you want to gravitate to the easiest pieces that you can find in this library. Many of the pieces in this library have either an MP3, a video, or even some kind of MIDI track that allows you to listen to the piece in one way or the other to hear what it sounds like. And that's very helpful before you start to try to read the piece. So the goal here on the classicbanjo.ning site is to get into this library and each day read through one of these scores or part of one of the scores. It's a way to have more music available to you that's written for the banjo, so you don't have to worry about transcribing it from one instrument to another. These pieces are written for the banjo, so they're fairly easy to follow, and if you look for these easier scores, you'll progress through these as well. This is a way to find more music to practice reading. The idea is to practice reading every day. And once you've gone through the Bradbury book a few times, you're going to be wanting additional things to read. And rather than trying to read something written for another instrument, here's a place to find lots of banjo music written for the banjo. The third step, or final step really, for this method of learning to read on the banjo, after you go through the Bradbury book several times, spend a lot of time on the .ning banjo website, is to then start trying to read music maybe written for other instruments. I would suggest easy books for oboe. The oboe's range from low note to high note is not that different than the banjo. And some oboe music I have found is fairly easy to read on the banjo. It's single note melodies, so it's pretty simple. And if you get some beginner oboe books or easy oboe books, these are good ways to practice reading. I might also recommend some beginner violin books or easy recorder books, books for recorder, or even flute. Some of these treble clef instruments can be useful to just put in front of you and try reading through a little bit each day once you've kind of gone through these other steps. Another thing to try is maybe if you want sometimes more than a single line melody is to try reading the right hand part in some piano pieces, maybe some easy piano pieces. Try reading just the right hand that's in the treble clef. So learning to read these scores that are written for other instruments will teach you a lot as far as wanting to move into the realm of doing your own transcriptions of other music for banjo. For instance, this is kind of training you to learn how to take a piece that was written, say, for violin and play it on the banjo, or something that maybe was written for the oboe and play it on the banjo. So this is a crucial step in this process. Well, I hope this method proves fruitful for you. Please let me know in the comments how you progress with this. I'd love to hear how it goes. Well, thanks for stopping by. We'll see you next time.